The smell of holiday garlic was overpowered by the sickly sweet scent of a perfect lie, especially when my mother-in-law praised the cheating husband who was secretly married to someone else. The air in the dining room was thick with the scent of roasted garlic and something sickly sweet. My mother-in-law, Brenda's, signature overly complicated casserole. It was Thanksgiving, a holiday I usually tolerated for the sake of my husband, Mark. This year, however, the tolerance was stretched thinner than the cheap wrapping paper I'd struggled with last Christmas. Brenda, bless her meticulously coiffed silver hair and pearl necklace, was beaming across the mahogany table, a look of serene, almost beatific approval plastered on her face. Mark, usually a boisterous presence, was quiet, picking at his plate with an unnerving focus, avoiding my eyes the way a deep-sea creature avoids the sun. "Honestly, sweetie," Brenda purred, dabbing the corner of her mouth with a linen napkin, "I have to say, you've really outdone yourself this year. The stuffing is divine, truly comforting." I managed a tight smile that probably looked more like a grimace. "Thank you, Brenda." "And Mark, darling," she continued, turning her gaze to her son, her voice softening to that saccharine pitch reserved for compliments and passive-aggressive commentary. "You look particularly rested today. You've been working so hard lately, keeping everything running smoothly at the firm. A good man needs a good support system, doesn't he?" Mark mumbled something that sounded like, "Yeah, sure, Mom." It was the way she said support system that made my blood run cold. For the past 6 months, working late had become Mark's new personality trait. The late-night work calls, the sudden business trips to cities he'd never mentioned before, the way he'd start sweating if I so much as brushed against his laptop bag. It all added up to a sum I desperately didn't want to calculate. But the numbers didn't lie, and the scent of unfamiliar perfume that clung faintly to his favorite cashmere sweater was proof enough. His mistress, I discovered through some painfully clumsy amateur sleuthing involving a misplaced receipt and a quick Google search, was a paralegal named Chloe, 24 years old and irritatingly photogenic. I hadn't confronted Mark yet. The silence was a battlefield I hadn't chosen to enter, mostly because I needed time to orchestrate the proper demolition. But Brenda was the wild card. She adored Mark with a suffocating intensity that bordered on cultish devotion. She had always viewed me, the competent, career-driven woman who actually managed the household budget, as slightly less than ideal, a necessary administrative accessory to her perfect son. "Speaking of Chloe," Brenda said suddenly, placing her wineglass down with a delicate clink. The sound echoed in the sudden vacuum of sound that followed. My fork froze halfway to my mouth. Mark choked slightly on his water. I looked up slowly. "I'm sorry, Brenda. Did you say Chloe?" Brenda waved a dismissive, perfectly manicured hand. "Oh, don't be so dramatic, dear. Mark mentioned he's been spending a lot of time with her recently. Professionally, of course. She's the paralegal assisting him with the Peterson merger, isn't she? He mentioned she's incredibly bright. A real asset." My grip tightened on my fork until my knuckles were white. This wasn't just a casual mention. This was an endorsement, a maternal blessing, delivered right over the turkey centerpiece. "An asset," I repeated flatly, pushing my plate away. The casserole suddenly looked like toxic waste. How wonderful for Mark's career. "It is," Brenda insisted, leaning forward, her eyes shining with what I now realized wasn't maternal pride, but genuine, enthusiastic admiration for the competition. "You know, it reminds me so much of when I was his age. Young women who truly understand ambition. Chloe has that spark, Mark tells me, that drive. You just don't see it as much in women who are focused on settling down." The implication was deafening. I was the settled-down impediment to Mark's brilliance, and Brenda was applauding the woman attempting to replace me. Mark finally found his voice, strained and high-pitched. "Mom, that's enough. It's work, nothing else." "Of course, darling, I know," Brenda soothed, turning back to me with a look of pity that was far more insulting than anger. "But frankly, dear, Mark needs someone who can keep up with his pace, someone who breathes the corporate air he breathes. You're wonderful with the domestic things, truly, the hosting, the decor, but Mark is a titan. He needs a titan by his side, not just a cheerful homemaker. The sheer audacity of it should have sent me through the roof, but something in Brenda's over-the-top praise, the almost desperate need she had to validate this other woman, tipped a balance in my mind. It wasn't just jealousy or protection, it felt like desperation. Why was she so invested in Chloe's brilliance, unless Chloe represented something she thought Mark needed? Later that evening, after the guests had left and Mark had retreated to his study with the flimsy excuse of catching up on emails, I found myself in the kitchen, nursing a scotch and staring at the chaos of dirty dishes. The real chaos, however, was inside my head. I needed proof beyond the vague scent of perfume and the suggestive praise of my mother-in-law. I needed to know why Brenda was so enthusiastic about the affair. My access to Mark's digital life was limited. He was paranoid about passwords. But Brenda was old school. She relied on paper trails and physical organization. And Mark, in his arrogance, often left his briefcase, the one he insisted I never touch, unlocked when he rushed out the door in the morning, usually while Brenda was helping him organize his notes before a big meeting. I waited until midnight. The house was silent save for the distant hum of the refrigerator. I slipped upstairs, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Mark's study door was ajar. He was asleep, finally, probably exhausted from his merger meetings. I crept in. His briefcase sat open on his desk chair. Inside, beneath stacks of quarterly reports, I found it. A small, embossed leather wallet, definitely not his. Inside, a driver's license belonging to Chloe Annabelle Hayes, and tucked behind it, a sheaf of laminated documents. They weren't romantic letters. They weren't hotel receipts. They were medical documents. My hands trembled as I pulled them out. The header read, St. Jude's Oncology Center. My breath hitched. This wasn't a paralegal's credentials. I flipped through the pages quickly, skimming the complex medical jargon until I hit a summary sheet with bolded headings. Patient. Hayes Chloe A. diagnosis, stage 4, glioblastoma multiforme, GBM. Prognosis. Poor. Aggressive treatment required. My entire world tilted. Chloe wasn't just a fling, she was terminally ill. And Brenda, his mother, knew. She wasn't praising a rival, she was praising a replacement, a successor, someone Mark was likely supporting through a horrific illness and hiding it from me. I stared at the papers, the scotch suddenly tasting like ash. Why would Brenda push this relationship so hard? Why the enthusiastic praise for a dying woman? It was cruel, almost supernatural in its manipulation, unless the situation wasn't what it seemed. I looked back at the file. There was a second, smaller file tucked underneath the main diagnosis report. It was stamped with a very specific, very familiar logo, the insurance provider for Mark's entire legal team, the same one I used. Curiosity, sharp and dangerous, overwhelmed my shock. I pulled the second file out. It contained detailed billing codes and approval forms. One form, heavily highlighted in yellow, caught my eye. It was a consent form for experimental treatment, signed not just by Chloe, but co-signed by a family member acting as durable power of attorney. The signature was shaky, looping, and instantly recognizable. It wasn't Mark's signature, it was Brenda's. My mother-in-law wasn't just Chloe's supporter, she was her legal guardian, her designated decision-maker in life and death. I frantically flipped the page to the front cover of the second file, looking for the section detailing the patient's next of kin or designated emergency contact. The name listed was Mark, and beneath Mark's name, in smaller print, was a notation that made the hairs on my arms stand straight up, stripping away every layer of my composure, every shred of my rational thought. Spouse/primary caregiver, Brenda Hayes. Wait, Hayes, not Markham. I snatched the identification card from the first file again. Chloe A. Hayes, and now this POA document listing Brenda Hayes as her primary caregiver, with Mark listed as secondary contact. It clicked, a horrific, cold mechanism engaging in my mind. Brenda wasn't protecting her son from an affair. She was managing a family secret so vast, so terrifying, it explained everything: the urgency, the secrecy, the suffocating need to validate Chloe. My own name, my marriage, my life, it was all built on a perfectly constructed lie. I looked back at the POA form, tracing the loops of Brenda's familiar, elegant signature. And then I saw the birth date listed right next to the name, Brenda Hayes. It wasn't Brenda Markham, my mother-in-law. It was the same name, same handwriting, but the birth date listed next to the signature on the legal document indicated a woman, 25 years younger than the woman currently sleeping down the hall. My mother-in-law, the one who served the casserole, was not Brenda Hayes. She was someone else entirely. And the real Brenda Hayes, the one connected to Chloe, was Mark's secret wife, the one who was dying and the one whose medical files I was currently holding. The cold logic of the revelation was breathtaking. Brenda Markham, the woman who had just praised my cooking and subtly belittled my domesticity, was an imposter, an elaborate decoy. The signature on the power of attorney document, Brenda Hayes, was the real one, attached to a birth date that made her the same age as Mark, not his mother. The woman I knew, the silver-haired matriarch, was playing a role so deep, so committed, that she had managed to fool her own son's wife for years. I slammed the file shut, the sound muffled by the thick carpet, and backed away from the desk as if the papers were radioactive. The implications spun out in a dizzying vortex. If the woman downstairs wasn't Mark's mother, who was she? And more terrifyingly, if the real Brenda Hayes was Mark's wife and Chloe's legal guardian, what did that make me? I tiptoed out of the study, every floorboard a potential trumpet announcing my betrayal. I needed air, I needed to think, but more than anything, I needed to confront the woman downstairs before dawn broke. I slipped into the guest room, the room Brenda insisted on calling the Lily Suite, and found my phone. I needed to cross-reference the two Brendas. I typed Mark Markham mother obituary into the search bar, my fingers clumsy with adrenaline. Nothing immediate. Mark's family history was deliberately opaque, mostly because Brenda Markham, the fake one, had carefully pruned the public record over the years. I switched tactics. I searched for Chloe A. Hayes St. Jude's. The results were immediate and brutal. Chloe Hayes was a rising star in corporate law, brilliant, ambitious, and according to a short, heavily censored news snippet from 3 months ago, had been forced to take a sudden medical leave. The accompanying photo showed a vibrant young woman with luminous eyes. The picture of health, a stark contrast to the grim prognosis in the folder. But there was another link, buried beneath a local charity fundraiser page. It showed a photograph from a gala event about 2 years ago. In the photo, Chloe Hayes was proudly accepting an award. Standing next to her, beaming with the same fierce, proprietary pride I'd witnessed at dinner, was the real Brenda Hayes, the one who looked Mark's age, wearing a dress strikingly similar to the one the fake Brenda wore last Easter. The fake Brenda, the one who was supposedly my mother-in-law, was actually... what? A very elaborate, decades-long stand-in? A very devoted aunt? A close family friend who had taken over the maternal role after the real mother passed or disappeared? I crept downstairs, bypassing the dark living room and heading straight for the basement door. Mark kept his old filing cabinets down there, relics from his college days he swore he'd clear out someday. If there was a paper trail connecting the two Brendas, the original family files would be there. The basement air was cold and smelled of damp concrete and forgotten things. I flipped the light switch. Dust motes danced in the weak yellow light. I found the filing cabinet labeled M to Z. It was heavy, but the lock was cheap, easily defeated with a bobby pin I always kept in my robe pocket for emergencies just like this. The first drawer yielded college transcripts and old tax returns. The second drawer was more promising. Tucked beneath a stack of obsolete lease agreements was a thick, pale blue folder labeled simply Hayes Family Trust. Primary documents. My heart hammered so hard I was sure Mark would hear it through the floorboards. Inside, the documents were almost blindingly clear. Mark's father, the man I'd only seen in faded photographs, had been married to Brenda Hayes. Chloe Hayes was listed as their only daughter. Mark's father had died 5 years ago, and then the bombshell hidden beneath the trust deed, a revised marriage certificate dated 4 years ago. Mark was married. He had married Chloe Hayes 4 years ago. My entire marriage to Mark, the last 7 years, had been a lie built upon a lie. I wasn't his wife. I was his mistress, the convenient, stable partner he kept on the surface, while he secretly cared for his true, ailing wife and her dying daughter. But the final twist was delivered on the last page of the file. It was a handwritten letter, brittle with age, addressed to Mark from his real mother, the one who looked his age, the one who was Chloe's mother. The letter detailed a terminal diagnosis for herself, the real Brenda Hayes, and outlined a desperate plan to ensure Chloe, her daughter, was cared for after she was gone, using Mark as the reliable anchor in her life. The letter ended with a plea. Mark, you must protect Chloe, but you cannot lose your public standing. You need a stable, respectable partner for the firm's image. The woman you've chosen, the one you call your fiancée, until the papers are finalized, she needs to step into the role of the devoted wife. She must be seen as your bedrock. She must believe she is your wife. And she must never, under any circumstances, know about Chloe or about me. For both your sakes, she must remain oblivious. This is the only way to keep the trust intact until Chloe's treatments are over. Do this for me, son. Keep the facade safe until the inevitable. The letter was signed, not Brenda Hayes, but an entirely different name, one I'd never heard before, Eleanor. I looked up at the dim ceiling, tears finally blurring my vision. The woman downstairs, the one currently sleeping under the name Brenda Markham, wasn't Mark's mother or his wife's mother. She was an actress, hired years ago by the dying Eleanor Hayes to play the role of mother-in-law, creating a perfect, uncomplicated background figure for Mark's respectable public life while he secretly navigated his real marriage to the terminally ill Chloe. And I was the placeholder wife, the perfectly ignorant prop designed to stand beside him until the real drama ended. I was the illusion. Suddenly, a floorboard creaked directly above me. The study. Mark must have woken up. I froze, holding the documents, the proof of a decade-long deception involving 2 generations of women, in my shaking hands. I heard the soft padding of feet on the landing above, moving toward the stairs. He was coming down. He knew I was gone from the bedroom. He knew I must have found something. I scrambled to shove the documents back into the cabinet, but I was too slow. The single bare bulb overhead flickered, plunging the room into momentary darkness, and when the light stuttered back on, Mark was standing at the top of the basement stairs, silhouetted against the faint glow from the hallway. He wasn't angry. He looked devastated, utterly broken. He looked exactly like a man whose carefully constructed world was about to collapse. "What are you doing down here?" he whispered, his voice raw, entirely stripped of its usual corporate arrogance. He took one step down, his eyes locking onto the slightly ajar filing cabinet drawer, then moving to my face. "You weren't supposed to look in there, Sarah. You promised you wouldn't dig any deeper." The silence that followed Mark's question was corrosive. It wasn't the silence of surprise. It was the silence of absolute captured guilt. He didn't ask what I had found. He asked why I was looking. The distinction was a knife twisting in the wound. I straightened up slowly, letting the weight of the files in my hand speak for me. I didn't raise my voice. In fact, my voice felt alien, low and steady, a dangerous calm settling over the tremor in my chest. "Dig deeper?" I echoed, letting the word hang between us, laced with the bitter irony of the last hour. Mark, I don't think I've ever been in the shallow end of this marriage. I thought I was marrying you. I didn't realize I was signing up for an extended cover story. He descended the last few steps, his posture collapsing from that of the powerful lawyer to a frightened boy hiding from a terrible truth. He looked past me, toward the open cabinet, his eyes wide with panic. "Sarah, please, give me those. You don't understand what you're holding. Those aren't—" "They are the Hayes family trust documents, Mark." I cut him off, holding up the brittle blue folder. "They list Chloe as your wife. They list Eleanor Hayes as your actual mother-in-law, the one who died 5 years ago. And they list a woman named Eleanor, not Brenda, writing you a desperate letter asking you to maintain a public facade with me, the oblivious placeholder, while you cared for the real Brenda Hayes, who is apparently acting as Chloe's dying mother's proxy." I watched his face drain of color. He looked truly ill, worse than he ever did when claiming a migraine from an all-night deposition. "And the woman downstairs?" I pressed, my voice sharpening. "The one serving turkey and telling me I'm not ambitious enough? Who is she, Mark? The other Brenda? Is she Eleanor's sister? A professional caretaker? How long has she been fooling me? How long have I been living with a stranger playing my mother-in-law?" Mark ran a hand through his already messy hair, his gaze darting around the concrete room as if seeking an escape route that didn't exist. She's family, a cousin. My actual mother died years ago, Sarah, long before we met. The woman downstairs, Brenda, she stepped in. She was Eleanor's closest confidant. When Eleanor got sick, she made me promise that for appearances, for the firm, the transition would be seamless, that she would become Mom. Seamless? I laughed, a harsh, joyless sound. "You've been married to Chloe for 4 years, and you let me believe I was engaged for 3 of those years, building a life with a man whose wife is currently fighting stage 4 cancer. And you're telling me the woman downstairs is just a cousin playing mom? Mark, you didn't just keep secrets. You manufactured an entire fictional family tree around me. It was protection," he pleaded, stepping closer. "Protection for you, Sarah. If the news about Chloe ever broke, the merger, the power struggles in her father's firm, it would destroy my career. I needed stability. I needed a safe harbor. You were that harbor. You are respectable. You are brilliant at what you do, and you would never be linked to the scandal of a secret marriage and a dying wife." "So I was the beard?" I spat, taking a step back toward the steel shelving. "I was the respectable wallpaper while you played grieving husband to your dying mother-in-law proxy and secretly managed your real marriage to your dying wife." The word dying hung heavy in the damp air. It explained Brenda Markham's strange protectiveness of Chloe. She wasn't jealous. She was grooming the next caregiver, ensuring the chain of command was solid. "Chloe is sick, Sarah. Very sick. She needs constant, focused care. Eleanor, the real Eleanor. She knew she wouldn't be around long enough to manage it all after her own diagnosis. She trusted me to keep Chloe stable, and she trusted Brenda, the cousin, to maintain the illusion of my normal life here, with you." "And where does I fit into Eleanor's grand, tragic plan?" I demanded, clutching the trust documents tighter. "Was I supposed to stand by your side at Chloe's funeral, holding your hand, the picture of the heartbroken widow, only to have you immediately inherit everything when Chloe passes, and then perhaps marry a real titan?" Mark recoiled as if struck. "No, Sarah, listen to me. I love you. I do. I love the life we built. But Chloe, she's my first commitment, my legal reality. I married her before I met you, under duress of her family's power. I was trapped. But you are my choice. I meant to tell you, I swear I did, when Chloe stabilized or when the worst happened. I was waiting for the right moment. The right moment was 7 years ago, Mark, when you asked me to move in," I shouted, the control finally shattering. "There is no right moment for admitting you're living a massive fraud. This isn't about protecting your career. This is about protecting your assets and your legacy while you manage two distinct lives." I backed up further, my hand brushing against something cold and metallic on the shelf, an old, heavy flashlight. "And the power of attorney," I continued, my voice trembling with rage and a dawning, sickening understanding. "You listed Brenda Hayes, the cousin, as Chloe's primary caregiver, with you as secondary. Why? Why not the real Brenda? Why have this cousin, this imposter mom, take the lead on Chloe's final decisions?" Mark took a deep breath, and in that moment his facade of broken honesty cracked, revealing the cold calculation beneath. He looked straight at me, his lawyer persona snapping back into place, sharp and dangerous. "Because, Sarah," he said, his voice dropping to a near inaudible register, "if Chloe dies while I'm officially married to you, the firm loses the leverage. The Hayes Trust dissolves immediately, and everything, including the contingency fund Eleanor set up for Chloe's care, goes into probate, accessible to Chloe's distant relatives. If the cousin, Brenda, is listed as the primary caregiver and executor, the transfer of assets to me, once I'm finally free of the marriage to Chloe, is clean, untouchable." My mind raced to catch up. Mark wasn't just cheating. He was involved in a long-con inheritance scheme, predicated on his wife's terminal illness and my total ignorance. The woman downstairs wasn't just a stand-in mother, she was the executor of the plot, the person poised to clear the path for his undisputed wealth. "You were waiting for Chloe to die so you could marry me officially," I whispered, horrified. "You were waiting for the payoff." Mark didn't deny it. He just stared at me, his eyes pleading for a truce I would never offer. "Sarah, put the files down. We can fix this. I can explain the legalities." He took another step down the concrete stairs, closing the gap between us. He reached out a hand, not to comfort, but to take the evidence from my grasp. That's when I saw it. Not in the files, not in his face, but reflected faintly in the glass of an old picture frame leaning against the wall. A picture of Mark and Chloe on their honeymoon, radiant and impossibly young. In the reflection, behind Mark, standing just outside the frame's edge, was a flicker of movement, a shadow that shouldn't have been there. I spun around toward the dark corner of the basement, flashlight raised instinctively. The beam cut through the gloom, illuminating a stack of dusty moving boxes, and perched atop the tallest box, watching us both with a chillingly serene expression, was the silver-haired woman I thought was my mother-in-law. But she wasn't wearing the pearls. She was wearing a crisp, dark suit, and cradled in her arms, slick and dark, was a firearm pointed directly at my chest. Her smile was gone. "I apologize, dear Sarah," the woman, the cousin, the executor, the fake Brenda, said, her voice now perfectly modulated, completely devoid of the warmth she'd used at dinner. "But Mr. Markham was right. This has gone deep enough. We cannot allow the primary asset to become compromised." The muzzle of the gun was steady, reflecting the harsh glare of the flashlight beam with an unnerving, almost polished gleam. The woman who had served me green bean casserole hours ago, who had patronized me about my lack of corporate spark, now stood as the executor of Mark's darkest plan, blocking my only exit. Compromised? My voice cracked on the word. I gripped the heavy flashlight like a talisman, knowing it was useless against steel, but unwilling to surrender the single piece of defense I held. I'm compromised? I'm the one who found out my husband is a bigamist, and my mother-in-law is an imposter running interference for a fatal inheritance scam. Mark, frozen halfway down the stairs, finally found his voice, a strangled shout of pure panic. "Brenda, no, stop! Sarah, put the files down. We can talk about this." The woman, the cousin, the fake Brenda, didn't even spare him a glance. Her focus was entirely on me, the liability. Mr. Markham, you were explicitly instructed by Eleanor regarding the chain of command. Sarah's discovery complicates the final dissolution phase. She cannot be allowed to leave this basement with those documents, or the narrative. Narrative. That was the key word. My entire existence here had been just another part of Mark and Eleanor's meticulous, deadly story. What narrative are you planning on leaving? I challenged her, slowly shifting my weight, trying to calculate the distance to the narrow window near the furnace. That I suddenly decided to move to Patagonia? Or maybe I just disappeared. A cold, genuine smile touched her lips, a smile that belonged to a predator, not a family friend. Disappearance is so cliché, dear. We prefer things to look like an unfortunate, albeit expected, tragedy. Stage 4 cancer leaves a lot of emotional debris, doesn't it? A grieving husband, a sudden need to clear out old correspondence. It's all very tidy. Mark finally moved, scrambling down the last few steps, putting himself between me and the gun. You will not touch her. I gave you my word, Brenda. You keep the trust clean. You handle the transfer, but you do not harm Sarah. Brenda's composure didn't waver. Your word is secondary to the terms of the trust, Mark. You failed to maintain the secrecy you were mandated to keep. You brought your other wife down into the archive of the real one. That is an immediate breach. I realized then the depth of my mistake. Mark hadn't been pleading with me to stop looking. He had been pleading with her not to execute the contingency plan prematurely. He was trapped by his own elaborate deception, unable to control the hired player in his supporting cast. "The files," I said, my voice surprisingly clear, adrenaline neutralizing the fear. "You want the files? You can have them, but you're going to have to take them from me." I lifted the flashlight high above my head, blinding her momentarily with the direct beam. It was a desperate, stupid move, but it bought a split second. I didn't run toward the stairs. I threw myself sideways toward the wall of boxes, simultaneously hurling the heavy flashlight past her head, aiming for the small, high window. The glass shattered with a loud, violent explosion that seemed deafening in the enclosed space. Brenda flinched at the noise, her focus momentarily broken, her aim wavering. That was all the chance Mark needed. He lunged, tackling her just as she attempted to steady her aim again. The gun discharged, the sound echoing painfully in the basement. The bullet didn't hit me. It struck the metal shelving unit just beside my head with a deafening ping, sending a shower of sparks and dislodged paint chips flying. I scrambled behind the nearest stack of dusty boxes, my heart threatening to burst through my ribs. Mark and Brenda were wrestling violently near the foot of the stairs. Mark, fueled by desperation to protect the one person he apparently didn't want dead, was fighting with surprising savagery against the calm, lethal efficiency of the hired cousin. "The basement door!" Mark roared at me, grappling with Brenda's arm as she fought to bring the weapon back to bear. "Sarah, the door is right there. Get out, call the police, tell them everything." I didn't hesitate. I scrambled out from behind the boxes, moving across the concrete floor, deafened by the ringing in my ears from the gunshot. I reached the heavy wooden door leading to the utility room, yanked the deadbolt, and threw my weight against it. It burst open onto a narrow, dark corridor leading to the back entrance of the house. Freedom was literally a few feet away. I looked back over my shoulder, hoping to see Mark following, hoping to see the hired cousin subdued. What I saw instead made me freeze with a terror colder than the basement air. Mark was lying on the floor, half submerged in shadow, unnaturally still. Brenda, the cousin, was standing over him, breathing heavily but entirely unharmed, the gun now firmly back in her grip. She looked down at Mark with cold detachment, then slowly turned her head toward me, framed perfectly in the doorway. She hadn't missed the first shot. She had missed me on purpose, knowing the ensuing chaos would force Mark to intervene, positioning him perfectly as the sacrificial lamb to secure the inheritance. "You're slow, Sarah," she murmured, advancing one deliberate step into the light of the utility room, her voice dropping its sophisticated accent, revealing a harsh, street-edge rasp I'd never heard before. He was always going to be the problem. Too much attachment. "Now, step back inside, or I promise you, the narrative will conclude with 2 bodies, and the police will find your fingerprint next to Eleanor's forged will, confirming you were the one trying to steal the assets from the dying wife." She raised the weapon again, and this time, her aim was steady, dead on. I had a split second. Retreat into the dark house and face execution, or bolt out into the cold, pitch-black November night and run for my life, branded as a murderer's accomplice. I threw myself backward, slamming the heavy door shut, hearing the click of the deadbolt engaging from the outside. She locked me in the utility room, trapping me between her and the still body of my supposed husband, and then the immediate, bone-jarring impact of the second shot hitting the reinforced wood panel inches from my head. I was trapped in a small, windowless room with the sound of the hired killer reloading directly on the other side of the door, and the horrifying realization that Mark, the man I thought I knew, was dead on the basement floor, having been sacrificed by his own conspirator to protect a fortune built on a lie that I, the oblivious placeholder, had accidentally dismantled. The sound of the third impact against the door, a dull, heavy thud, told me the cousin was switching tactics. She was done trying to scare me and was preparing to smash her way through. Panic curdled into ice-cold clarity. I had to get out, and I had to do it without the phone I'd left charging in the bedroom, without keys, and with a highly motivated assassin just feet away. I scanned the utility room frantically. It was narrow, filled with cleaning supplies, water heaters, and a narrow, seldom-used ventilation grate near the ceiling, likely leading to the outside ground level beneath the deck. It was a ludicrously small opening, but it was my only option. I dragged a heavy bag of rock salt toward the wall, stacking it precariously beneath the grate. My muscles screamed in protest, fueled only by the image of Mark lying dead because of his own tangled web. I climbed onto the unstable tower of supplies, the metal grate resisting my efforts with a stubborn screech. Through the thin wooden door, I could hear the muffled sounds of Brenda, the cousin, working methodically. She wasn't yelling anymore. She was just efficiently breaking through the barrier, an unstoppable, emotionless force. I gritted my teeth and kicked upward with the heel of my boot, leveraging my weight. The screws holding the grate groaned, then snapped. I shoved the metal aside and squeezed into the opening. The space was tight, smelling of damp earth and dead leaves. I scrabbled forward on my elbows and knees, ignoring the sharp stones biting into my skin, pulling myself toward the faint promise of moonlight filtering through a larger exterior vent further down. As I cleared the first section and pulled myself into the wider exterior vent shaft, I heard the utility room door splinter inward behind me. "She's gone!" Brenda's voice, sharp and enraged, echoed from the small room. I heard her heavy footsteps entering the utility space, followed by the sound of her dragging something across the concrete floor, likely a tool to pry open the vent shaft. I kicked out violently, dislodging a section of loose drywall at the shaft's end, creating a sudden cascade of dust and debris that rained down directly onto her position. It bought me precious seconds. I wriggled through the opening and tumbled out onto the damp lawn under the sprawling oak tree near the back fence line. I didn't stop to look back at the house, at the study where the evidence lay, or at Mark's body. That nightmare belonged to the police eventually. My priority was distance and communication. I ran blindly across the yard, vaulting the low stone wall into the neighboring property's overgrown field. I ran until the adrenaline began to ebb, leaving me weak, shivering and covered in dirt, finally reaching the dimly lit county road, half a mile away. A car finally appeared in the distance, a battered pickup truck driven by a local heading toward the main highway. I stepped into the road, waving my arms with the wild desperation of someone who had just clawed her way out of a grave. The truck screeched to a halt. The driver, a kindly older man named George, took one look at my torn silk robe, my bleeding hands, and the wild terror in my eyes, and didn't ask a single question. He just pulled open the passenger door. "Get in, honey. Where are we going?" "The police station," I managed, gasping for air. "And the hospital. I need to report a murder." The next few hours were a blur of sterile white lights, urgent voices, and the agonizing process of recounting a story so outlandish. The fake mother-in-law, the secret wife, the terminal illness, the inheritance plot, that I feared they'd commit me before they believed me. I handed over the Hayes family trust documents, the forged POA, everything I had grabbed. The police investigation moved with terrifying speed, confirming the immediate facts. Mark Markham was deceased in his basement, a single gunshot wound. The body of the woman they initially identified as his mother, Brenda Markham, was nowhere to be found. The breakthrough came 2 days later, after a warrant was executed at the address listed on the original POA, a small, nondescript condominium miles away. They found the woman I knew as Brenda, sitting calmly in the living room, still dressed in expensive tailored clothes, attempting to burn the final few financial documents related to the trust. She was arrested without incident, identified as Brenda Hayes, a distant cousin of Mark's deceased father, recruited years ago by the real Eleanor Hayes to serve as a contingency player. Chloe Hayes, Mark's terminally ill wife, was located in a specialized clinic upstate, receiving experimental treatment. When questioned, she was devastated by Mark's death, confirming that she knew nothing of Sarah or of the Brenda Markham persona. She confirmed her mother, Eleanor, had orchestrated the entire elaborate scheme to protect Chloe's legacy and assets, ensuring Mark could maintain a respectable facade until her own death forced his hand. Chloe confirmed that her mother's last wish was for Mark to eventually leave the placeholder wife and reunite with her, to care for her until the end, a plan Mark had been eagerly awaiting. My testimony, supported by the trove of documents and Brenda Hayes' subsequent silence under interrogation, was enough. The police closed the case quickly. Mark Markham, trapped between 2 wives and facing ruin from a complex inheritance scheme, had likely been killed by his accomplice, Brenda Hayes, when I threatened to expose the entire operation prematurely. The narrative shifted. Mark was a desperate man trying to protect his first wife's fortune, ultimately betrayed by the very operative he relied upon for secrecy. I walked out of the precinct building into the pale afternoon sun a week later, legally widowed, financially devastated, and emotionally shattered, but finally, definitively free. The sham was over. I drove straight to the hospital where Chloe was staying. I found her in a quiet, sunlit room, looking frail but peaceful. When I walked in, she didn't look shocked. She looked like someone who had been waiting for the inevitable conclusion of a long, sad drama. "You're Sarah," Chloe stated softly, her voice thin. I nodded, standing awkwardly by the door. "I am. I'm so sorry about Mark, and about everything." Chloe managed a weak smile. "Don't be. Mark was never the victim. He was just too greedy to leave the board before the game ended. He played his hand perfectly until you showed up, holding the one card he couldn't account for, the truth." She gestured toward a small, closed box on her bedside table. "Eleanor wanted me to give you this. Should you ever come looking, she said you were the only honest person in the whole rotten structure." I cautiously approached the bed and took the box. It was heavy, made of dark, polished wood. I opened it. Inside, nestled on velvet, wasn't jewelry or cash. It was a single, thick, official-looking envelope, sealed with the insignia of the International Law Bar Association. "What is this?" I asked. Chloe blinked slowly. "It's the deed to the firm. Eleanor always said Mark would eventually try to seize control of my inheritance assets once I was gone. She couldn't divorce him without triggering collapse, but she could disinherit him. That box, that envelope, It contains the executed papers naming you as the majority shareholder of Markham and Associates, effective immediately upon Mark's death or documented abandonment of duty. Eleanor wanted you to have the power to dismantle everything he built. I stared at the envelope, then at Chloe, then back at the envelope. The game hadn't ended with Mark's death. It had only just begun for me. The placeholder wife, the oblivious accessory, was now, by the machinations of the dying, in control of the empire that had enslaved her. I never wanted the firm, I whispered. Chloe closed her eyes, a single tear tracing a path down her temple. I know, but you wanted justice, and you deserve a life where you are never anyone's cover story again. The resolution wasn't peace, it was power. I held the deed in my hands, the tangible proof that the woman who had scorned me for being domestic now possessed the ultimate weapon against the life she had forced upon me. The final act of the drama would be cleaning up the wreckage, not as the victim, but as the undisputed architect of its dissolution.